Horror games often ask us to survive, but the most unsettling ones ask us something harder. What do you do when something refuses to let go? Japanese folklore gives us a name for this kind of haunting, Onryo. These are spirits that remain in the world due to unfinished business, rage, grief, and most famously, grudges. As William Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead. It's not even past. In horror games, that observation is literal. The Onryo is the past made visible, a presence that refuses to move on, assisting the world remember what was done and what was left unresolved. It is not simply a ghost, it is a memory and emotion made flesh. This is why horror games are drawn repeatedly to these figures. The long black hair, the ghostly white skin, the obscured face. These are not just visual cliches, they are signs, warnings, that something here has unfinished business, and that the environment itself carries the weight of memory. From Japanese survival horror to the empty halls of Korean schools and the remnants of American laboratories, the story is the same. Something terrible happened, and it never ended. The Onryo reminds us that horror is rarely about death alone. It's about what survives it, what refuses to fade, what turns grief and rage into a presence, a shadow that falls long after the body is gone. To understand why horror games keep returning to this figure, we must look past the games themselves and trace the source, the legends, beliefs, and emotional logic that gave birth to the Onryo. The term Onryo is often reduced to a visual image: long black hair, pale skin, a silent female ghost. But in folklore, appearance was never the essence. What defined an Onryo was its cause. An Onryo was born when emotion, rage, grief, jealousy, humiliation found no outlet in life and no resolution in death. These spirits did not linger simply to punish. They lingered because something essential had been denied: acknowledgement, justice, or emotional release. Their haunting was not a choice. It was a consequence made visible. The crucial point is not the supernatural, but the logic beneath it. The Onryo embodies emotion that has exceeded the limits of containment. It is not evil in the conventional sense. It is precise, bound to places, relationships, and memories. This distinction matters for horror games. When they borrow the Onryo, they rarely adapt folklore literally. Instead, they use its emotional architecture. The ghosts that appear in games may not be traditional spirits, but they operate according to the same rules: unresolved business that becomes the engine of fear. The belief in Onryo did not emerge from fear of death itself, but from a fear of what happens when social order fails to account for emotional consequence. Early accounts of Onryo in Japan, particularly during the Heian period, often centered on individuals who were publicly wronged, politically sidelined, or privately betrayed, people whose suffering was acknowledged only after it began to affect others. These stories were not framed as isolated hauntings. And Onryo's presence was believed to ripple outward, manifesting as illness, misfortune, crop failure, or even political instability. The implication was clear: unresolved emotion was not a private matter. When ignored long enough, it became a collective problem. Rage that could not be addressed in life returned as something that demanded attention in death. What makes this important is how structured these narratives were. The Onryo did not appear randomly. Their influence followed patterns, specific locations, recurring victims, repeated calamities. This repetition reinforced the idea that the haunting was not chaotic, but casual. Something had gone wrong, and until that wrong was recognized, the consequences would continue. In response, societies developed rituals meant not to destroy these spirits, but to appease them. Memorials, prayers, and honors were attempts to resolve what had been left unresolved. The belief was that the haunting would only end when the emotional imbalance was corrected. This belief system quietly establishes a logic that horror games would later mirror almost perfectly. Unresolved emotion creates repetition. Repetition shapes space, and progress is impossible until the cause is confronted, not avoided. The Onryo was not feared because it was rare, but because it was plausible. Its origins were tied to lives lived under constraint, particularly with social systems that allowed little room for emotional expression. In historical Japan, women occupied positions where anger, jealousy, and grief were not only discouraged, but dangerous to voice openly. These emotions had to be endured in silence. This social suppression mattered. In Onryo narratives, this inward pressure is what transforms suffering into something persistent. The haunting is not an eruption of madness, but the continuation of a silence that began in life. What returns after death is not chaos, but the consequence of restraint. As a result, the Onryo became a reflection of a systemic failure rather than individual cruelty. These spirits were not framed as morally corrupt or malicious by nature. They were feared because they represented what happened when social structures refused to acknowledge them. Their persistence was a reminder that emotional injustice does not resolve itself simply because it's ignored. This context explains why the archetype carries such a weight even outside its original culture. Horror games frequently draw on figures who are silent, fixated, and bound to specific spaces, not because of tradition, but because these traits communicate the same idea. Unresolved emotion has nowhere to go, so it remains. At the core, the Onryo archetype is not fear of the supernatural, but the fear of emotional permanence. Rage, grief, jealousy, and trauma are not frightening on their own. They become frightening when they refuse to fade. The Onryo embodies the idea that emotion, when left unchecked, does not weaken with time, it concentrates. This concentration is what gives the archetype its unsettling quality. Unlike monsters that escalate through action, the Onryo escalates through persistence. The emotion repeats, unchanged, bound to a specific memory or space. There is no development, no release, only continuation. What terrifies is not what might happen next, but the certainty that nothing has moved on. Unfinished rage, in particular, carries a sense of inevitability. It does not lash out randomly, it returns to the same point again and again. This repetition creates a psychological pressure that mirrors real human experience. Grief that resurfaces, anger that replays itself, trauma that reasserts its presence without warning. The haunting feels personal because it behaves the way unresolved emotion behaves in reality. This is why the archetype resonates so strongly beyond folklore. It is immediately legible. Even without cultural context, players recognize what they are witnessing, a presence defined not by intent, but by fixation. The ghost does not need motivation explained, because its behavior already communicates it. Once emotion becomes something that repeats instead of resolves, fear stops being about surprises and starts being about endurance. In folklore, unresolved emotion was never treated as a private burden. When an Onryo emerged, it was believed that its fixation could extend beyond the individual who caused them harm and begin to affect the surrounding world. Illness, repeated accidents, crop failure, or sudden misfortune were interpreted not as coincidence, but as symptoms of an emotional imbalance left unaddressed. Horror games inherit this idea. Hauntings persist not because the player is weak, but because something remains unacknowledged within the game world. Progress is rarely achieved through force. It comes through repetition, attention, and confrontation of what the space is trying to remember, because the Onryo archetype is rooted in emotion rather than action. Its design has always relied on visual cues that communicate persistence and restraint. Long, unbound hair obscures the face, not to conceal identity, but to suggest withdrawal and inward focus. Pale skin reflects stagnation, a body removed from vitality, but not from presence. White clothing, traditionally associated with death and ritual, reinforces the sense of something unfinished rather than something transformed. These traits are not decorative. They function as a shorthand for emotional fixation. The figure appears incomplete, suspended between states, neither fully gone nor fully present. Even the lack of expression becomes meaningful. Silence and stillness imply containment, emotion held in, rather than released outward. What matters is consistency. Across culture and media, these elements reoccur because they communicate the same idea instantly. It is not a threat defined by movement or aggression. It is defined by refusal to leave. The visual language does the work of explanation before any narrative context is given. In horror games, this restraint becomes especially effective. The player is not confronted with spectacle, but with repetition. Seeing the same figure in the same posture across different spaces reinforces the sense that the haunting is governed by internal rules, not choice, not chance. The ghost's appearance feels inevitable, as though summoned by the environment itself. Once fear can be communicated through recognition rather than surprise, the experience becomes less about shock and more about anticipation. Before horror games fully embraced the Onryo archetype, cinema refined it. Japanese horror films in the late 90s and early 2000s did not invent these figures, but they standardized how unresolved emotion should behave on screen. Films like Ringu, Ju-on, and Dark Water emphasize reoccurrence over escalation, teaching audiences to associate fear with inevitability rather than surprise. These films treated the ghost less as an antagonist and more as a condition. The haunting was not something characters could escape through intelligence or strength. It followed rules that were emotional rather than physical. Once triggered, it repeated. Once acknowledged, it demanded completion. The horror came from understanding that time alone would not weaken it. Crucially, cinema established that explanation did not bring relief. Knowing the ghost's origin rarely stopped it. In many ways, understanding only deepened the sense of dread, because it confirmed that the haunting was justified by something irreversible. Rage had already taken root. The damage had already been done. This approach shaped how audiences learned to read these figures. Silence, stillness, and delayed appearances became signs of certainty, not restraint. It felt less like an event and more like confirmation that something unresolved had resurfaced. Horror games inherited this language but changed one critical element. Instead of watching characters endure repetition, players are placed in it. Horror games are uniquely equipped to express unresolved emotion because they operate through participation rather than observation. Where film presents repetition as something the audience witnesses, games make repetition something the player performs. This distinction matters because fixation ceases to be symbolic once it becomes experimental. The Onryo archetype aligns naturally with this structure. Its defining trait, persistence without resolution, mirrors the fundamental loop of the gameplay itself. Players revisit spaces and re-encounter the same elements until progression is achieved. In this context, a haunting that refuses to end feels less like a scripted event and more like an extension of the system. Games also collapse the distance between cause and consequence. The player's presence often triggers the haunting, not through intention, but through proximity. Simply being there is enough. This reinforces the idea that unresolved emotion does not wait for permission to surface. It asserts itself when conditions allow. Most importantly, games remove the safety of passivity. The player cannot look away or wait for the scene to end. Progress requires continued engagement with the space, shaped by fixation. Fear emerges not from danger alone, but from the knowledge that withdrawal is not an option. The player is no longer studying fixation, they are trapped inside it. To see how this logic operates in practice, we have to step into the spaces where it takes form. Case Study 1. Reika Kuze, Fatal Frame 3. Reika Kuze embodies the Onryo archetype in a way that feels both familiar and unsettling. In Fatal Frame 3, she is tied to grief and ritualized vengeance, lingering in spaces where tragedy occurred and appearing only when the player triggers the right conditions. Her presence is never arbitrary, she is bound to the location and the story, a persistent reminder of unresolved events. What makes Reika compelling is how her rage is reflected in the environment. Doors that creak open, faint whispers, and a sudden shadow signals her proximity, creating tension even when she is not visible. The repetition of these cues mirrors the archetype's emotional logic. Grief and rage do not dissipate quietly. They assert themselves repeatedly. Mechanically, Reika's appearances force the player to confront the haunting directly. Using the camera to scare, players interact with her presence to progress, essentially performing the ritual that the archetype demands. Ignoring her is not an option. If she catches you, it counts as an insta-kill. Visually and narratively, Reika communicates fixation without dialogue, silent, pale, and bound to specific spaces. She shapes every movement the player spends in the game. Through her, the Onryo archetype is translated into an interactive experience, where the emotional persistence of the spirit becomes a core gameplay. Her power does not come from what she did in life, but from the weight of encountering her. When she appears, the game slows. Movement becomes deliberate, almost reluctant. The player is not chased, they are drawn in. Her design leans into the Onryo silhouette, long black hair obscuring the face, pallid skin, restrained movement. Reika doesn't perform aggression, she occupies space in a way that makes the player feel like an intruder, turning fear inward. Instead of panic, the player experiences unease, hesitation. Looking at her is uncomfortable. You see the sense of dread. She fits the Onryo archetype to a T. The Onryo functions as pressure, not a threat. Presence that asks the player to linger when they want to leave. Horror games weaponize empathy through this version of the Onryo. Reika is frightening because she feels heavy. She doesn't demand action, she drains it. Case Study 2. Na Young, White Day, Alaric Named School. Han Na Young, the older sister of So Young, is one of the most tragic figures in White Day, Alaric Named School. Her death, by hanging herself in the school before the events of the game, is central to the haunting atmosphere. Unlike many ghosts, Na Young is not aggressive. She does not attack or trigger chase mechanics. Her presence is narrative-driven, tied to the story, space, and unresolved emotional weight rather than combat or threat. Her visual design demonstrates how horror games prioritize cues over realism. In life, Na Young had short hair. In death, however, her hair grows long and black, obscuring her face, both in the original and remake versions. This impossible hair growth signals her as an Onryo-like spirit, and players immediately recognize the lingering presence. The 2001 version depicts her with bright white skin, emphasizing her spectral nature. The 2015 remake shifts her skin to gray, matching the darker atmospheric aesthetic. Despite these visual changes, her role remains consistent. She appears in scripted locations, tied to her death, guiding players and reinforcing the school's tragic history. Na Young appears in key rooms, hallways, near her former classrooms, or spaces tied to So Young during moments that highlight unresolved emotional threads. These scripted appearances ensure her presence feels deliberate and narratively anchored rather than random, reinforcing the weight of her unresolved story. Mechanically, Na Young's encounters do not threaten the player. She cannot be interacted with, she does not deal damage, she does not chase. Her presence communicates the persistence of unfinished emotion, a quiet, unavoidable reminder of past tragedies. Through repetition and careful placement, players experience the tension of lingering history rather than immediate danger. Na Young exemplifies how horror games translate the Onryo archetype without aggression. Her long black hair, grayish skin, and silent appearances signal emotional persistence. Her depth, appearances, and placement convey unfinished rage and sorrow, a haunting that is psychological, spatial, and narrative. Despite impossible hair growth and changing skin tone, these conditions make her instantly recognizable as a persistent, sorrowful spirit, balancing archetype recognition, atmosphere, and emotional storytelling. Ultimately, Na Young illustrates the dual function of Onryo-inspired design. Her presence defies literal logic by Hans' perception of lingering rage, cementing her role as one of the most emotionally resonant figures in the game. Case Study 3. Alma Wade. Fear. Alma Wade is a notorious figure in horror games, yet her terror is not born from overt violence. It emerges from the gravity of her life, the trauma she endured, and the psychic residue it left behind. In the first F.E.A.R, players encounter Alma in her child form, a small girl in a red dress, long black hair veiling her face. This image is unnerving. Her posture, her silence, the way she appears in the point man's peripheral vision, all signal something unresolved. Alma doesn't engage in direct combat. Instead, she flickers through corridors, appears in monitors, appears in shadows, distorts the environment, then vanishes. These moments are brief but destabilizing. The player cannot predict her presence besides the occasional screen flicker and the eerie silence before she appears. Each appearance carries the weight of her history, experimentation, confinement, and a childhood taken away. Alma mirrors the Onryo not simply through long hair and childlike silhouette, but through emotional logic. She is fixation given form, trauma that has not diminished with time, but intensified. The fear she generates is not rooted in immediate danger, but in accumulation. In this way, Alma demonstrates a core principle of horror. What terrifies us is not always the attack, but the weight of what remains. And every time she appears, the player is reminded that nothing here has been resolved. In these three case studies, Reika Kuze in Fatal Frame 3, Na Young in White Day, and Alma Wade in F.E.A.R, a fascinating pattern emerges. The Onryo archetype is not fixed. Its visual cues, narrative function, and emotional resonance shift depending on the cultural lens and gameplay design. Yet one constant remains. The core of these spirits is lingering presence, and trauma that refuses resolution. Horror games don't just ask us to survive. They ask us to witness what refuses to die. We cannot glance away, skip a sequence, or ignore a corridor. Each step we take brings us closer to the weight these figures carry. The lingering echo of trauma, neglect, or rage that refuses to resolve. Repetition in these games mirrors the logic of unresolved emotion. It is not random, but patterned. Not capricious, but inevitable. Each visual design reinforces this. Long black hair, pale or gray skin, obscured faces. These cues immediately communicate fixation and lingering intent. In the case of Na Young, her hair grows impossibly long after death, yet the visual image is instantly recognizable. Alma Wade flickers at the edge of perception, a person with a tragic life, yet every detail of her appearance conveys decades of unprocessed trauma. Reika's presence slows the game rather than accelerates it, forcing the player into deliberate confrontation with what lingers. Each design choice transforms emotion into spatial and mechanical tension, making the player feel the suffering as a lived experience. The writer, Toni Morrison, once said, "The function of freedom is to free someone else." In the context of horror games, the Onryo embodies the inverse. When agency is denied, when suffering is silenced, the consequences don't vanish, they persist. Reika, Na Young, and Alma remind us that when suffering remains unacknowledged, it saturates in the spaces we inhabit and insists on being reckoned with. Across cultures and game worlds, the logic remains constant. Unresolved emotion repeats, persists, and reshapes reality. Rage, grief, trauma, they do not vanish when ignored. They accumulate, asserting themselves until acknowledgement is granted. Fear emerges not from immediate danger, but from the certainty that nothing has moved on. And so, we must ask ourselves, if the past refuses to release its hold, what happens if it never lets go?